Putin's spring offensive isn't going to plan, and that is putting it mildly. What is supposed to be Russia's final push to take the Donbas has morphed into something very different. Ukraine is taking everything back. This is diversification in action, and it's not Russia that is making the final push. It's Ukraine. The total liberation of the Ukrainian nation has begun, and Putin isn't ready for the all-out offensive that is coming his way. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Early March saw the beginning of Russia's grand offensive, which Putin designed specifically to finally topple the last remaining standout settlements in Luhansk, and more importantly the Donetsk fortress belt that stands in the way of Russia and complete control of the Donbas. Russia built up tens of thousands of soldiers. Putin claimed to have reserves, and all of the Russian propaganda pointed to the inevitable fall of one of the most important Ukrainian regions. If you listen to Putin, you'd think the collapse of the Donbas was inevitable. It isn't. Despite Putin's bluster, Russia's spring offensive has been an unmitigated disaster that is achieving the precise opposite of what it was designed to do. It isn't Russia that is gaining territory. It's Ukraine liberating vast swaths of land. The April numbers are in, and they look terrible for Putin. April 2026 has seen Russia record its first net territorial loss since August 2024. Those with long memories will recall that August 2024 was when Ukraine launched its blistering counteroffensive into Russia's Kursk region, through which it took control of over 1,000 kilometers or around 386 miles of Russia. What we're seeing now isn't quite as dramatic in terms of the numbers of where Ukraine is attacking, but it is crucial. Why? Ukraine isn't pushing deeper into Russian land, it's reclaiming its own territory, and at a striking pace. In April alone, Ukrainian forces gained roughly 116 square kilometers, or 44.7 square miles, more territory than Russia. Data from the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, suggests Russia's spring offensive is steadily unraveling, with Putin's forces facing mounting battlefield problems that continue to weaken their momentum. And this downturn didn't appear overnight. Even March proved deeply disappointing for Russian advances. The month the spring offensive started saw Russia achieve close to zero net gains across 31 days of fighting. The ISW reports that Russia only managed to take 23 kilometers, or 8.9 square miles of Ukraine in March, and it seems likely that it has lost all of that territory and more in April. What we're seeing here is a complete turnaround in operational tempo that is happening at the worst possible time for Putin. Contrast today's figures to those from 2025. According to the Kyiv Post, Russia's forces were capturing about 12.9 square kilometers, or around 5 square miles of Ukraine every day in March 2025. So 2 days of fighting in March 2025 would have given Russia more territory than an entire month of fighting during March 2026. That's not a good look for Putin, and now we see Russia achieving a net territorial loss for April. It's clear that momentum is shifting. Diversification of Ukraine is now happening at a rate of about 3.87 kilometers, or 1.5 square miles every single day. The Kyiv Post reports, "How on earth has this happened? The spring was supposed to be the start of the inevitable Russian victory. What is happening right now has caught everybody off guard, barring Ukraine, which had been preparing for this all along. A combination of Ukrainian brilliance and Russian incompetence has led to Ukraine's startling results, and we'll be digging into both. But first, there's one more thing to cover: Russia's losses. They are staggering. We already have the numbers for Russia's catastrophic march. They were record-breaking. As Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky revealed, Putin churned through 35,351 of his soldiers to make practically no gains in March, which was over 350 troops more than the 35,000 casualties suffered in December 2025, which previously held Russia's grimmest Ukraine war record. The numbers aren't in for April yet. Ukraine is still tabulating them. But if April 29th is anything to go by, we're going to see something similar to go alongside Russia's scoring its first net territorial loss since 2024. On April 29th, Russia lost 1,470 of its soldiers, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense reports. Multiply that figure across 30 days and the result is a staggering monthly loss of 44,100 troops. For Putin, the situation continues to spiral downward. Russia's spring offensive has effectively fallen apart before it could properly begin, and Ukraine is exploiting every weakness. The Kyiv Post reports that March alone saw Ukraine reclaim close to 50 square kilometers, or roughly 20 square miles of occupied territory. Meanwhile, advances made during February and late January totaled around 480 square kilometers, equal to 185 square miles. The Ukrainian counterpush is measured, precise, and it targets key locations that disrupt Russian logistics and maneuvers all across the front. Ukraine's April 2026 result wasn't a one-off. It's part of a pattern that has defined the entire year. Russia boasts, but it's Ukraine that is making all of the positive battlefield moves. Ukraine is on an all-out offensive that is destroying every plan that Putin made for 2026. But we come back to the question of how this is happening. Russian propaganda indicated that it was Putin's forces in the ascendancy leading into 2026. Coincidentally, that propaganda ramped up in December, which was right around the time that Putin was gearing up to make his case in another round of peace talks. But for all of the propaganda, we're now seeing the opposite of what Russia said would happen. Why? Ukraine has a huge part to play, of course, and we'll be getting to that. But perhaps the biggest issue for Russia is that 2026 is laying Putin's strategic incompetence bare. Right now, we're seeing a broad slowdown in the Russian offensive across the entire front line. That slowdown has been happening for a long time. As the ISW reports, the Russian rate of advance across the battlefield has been steadily declining since November 2025, as continued Ukrainian ground counterattacks, Ukrainian mid-range strikes, the February 2026 block on Russia's use of Starlink terminals in Ukraine, and the Kremlin's throttling of Telegram have exacerbated existing problems within the Russian military. The Institute says, indeed, we've seen that slowdown in real time. Back in November 2025, Russia was slow, but it still managed to seize about 575 kilometers, or around 222 miles of Ukraine. December saw a drop of around 40 or 50 kilometers, or about 15.4 to 19.3 miles. Since then, Russia's advance has been in freefall in terms of its monthly numbers, all leading up to April 2026 and its first net territorial loss since August 2024. A large part of the reason why this is happening is that Russia has simply failed to adapt to conditions on the ground in Ukraine. The winter of 2025 and into 26 was a little colder and significantly wetter than the winter of the previous year, the ISW points out, and that has resulted in March and April being exceptionally muddy, as a combination of spring rains and defrosting ground creates a sort of soupy terrain. Russia has responded to this the only way that Putin knows how: throw more meat and metal at Ukraine. It's going about as well as you might expect. We've seen what's happening to the meat as Ukraine logs record casualties against Russia's forces. The metal, or Russia's mechanized units, are practically useless. Tanks and armored vehicles are struggling to maneuver through Ukraine's muddy terrain, severely limiting Russia's ability to provide fire support or shield assault units advancing on the front lines. Once armored vehicles become trapped in the thick mud, Russian troops aren't ordered to wait for better conditions or regroup strategically. They get out of their vehicle and march through the mud until a Ukrainian drone inevitably finds and eliminates them. It's the same old story from Putin that we've seen throughout the war. Human wave assaults backed by artillery and glide bombs seem to be all that Russia really has in its locker. And the strategy is becoming ever less effective as Ukraine's drone-infested kill zones expand, and Russia's infiltration tactics are turned on their head. But the real problem for Russia is this: it can't keep up with what it's trying to do in Ukraine right now, and that's a key reason why the diversification is going so well. Lies spread by his generals and a falling appetite for war in his country are combining to thwart Putin's plans. But a quick side note before we dig into that. You're watching The Military Show, and we bring you the reality behind the headlines. Hit subscribe if you want to stay ahead of the curve. Russia's liars, we mean generals, are trying to hide everything that's happening. They've crafted an alternative reality where Russia is in the ascendancy. And the craziest thing about this is that Putin probably believes them. Russia's president is a man who punishes those who tell him things he doesn't want to hear, which has resulted in his creation of a group of toadies who lie to him just to ensure they're not the next crony who takes an unexpected fall out of a Russian window. Leading Russia's campaign of battlefield propaganda is Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces. On April 21st, AA covered Gerasimov's claims that Russian forces had captured more than 80 Ukrainian settlements, along with roughly 1,700 square kilometers, or 656 square miles of Ukrainian territory. According to Gerasimov, March and April were far from months marked by stalled advances or heavy territorial setbacks for Russia. Oh no, Russia was still gaining ground during those months. 34 Ukrainian settlements and 700 kilometers, or 270 miles, had been captured during the first couple of months of Russia's spring offensive. Gerasimov was lying. Whether that was to fool those outside of Russia or to save his own skin is yet to be determined. Putin will be happy to wallow in the alternate reality his generals are creating, because what's actually happening is far from what he wants to hear. The net territorial losses and diversification of so much of Ukraine's territory are bad enough. But think about what Putin's antiquated tactics need to have any chance of succeeding. Manpower. You can't have a meat grinder strategy if you don't have any meat to feed into the grinder. On top of everything that is going wrong for Russia right now, the fact that it isn't recruiting enough soldiers to sustain the spring offensive that is already falling apart may be the worst thing of all. The UK's Ministry of Defense has already highlighted what's happening on the Russian recruitment front, as it says that March marked the fourth consecutive month that Russia lost more soldiers than it was able to recruit. Uncoincidentally, that would mean December was the start of the shortfall, which also just happens to be the same month where Russia's territorial gains started the freefall that has led them into the situation where Ukraine is the nation pushing forward and claiming land.
The Kyiv Post goes a little deeper. It points out that Russia plans to recruit 409,000 contract soldiers by the end of 2026, but it isn't getting anywhere close to that target. Russia is recruiting an average of 1,120 soldiers per day, which is just barely covering a daily casualty rate that typically lands between 1,000 and 1,200. And as seen on April 29th, those numbers can rise even higher. At its current recruitment pace, Russia is set to fall short of its manpower targets by thousands of troops by the end of 2026. On top of that, Ukraine is not slowing down or easing pressure. Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov has outlined a goal of 50,000 Russian casualties per month by late 2026. If that target is reached, Russia's already fragile recruitment system will be further overwhelmed by mounting battlefield losses. It won't only be about losing territory anymore for Moscow. The bigger concern will become the steady erosion of its soldier numbers. And beyond that, Russia's military strength is deteriorating in several other critical ways. Putin doesn't look for talent when he assigns his generals. He looks for subservience combined with a willingness to be as corrupt as you need to be survive in the twisted structure of the Russian military.